Welcome to this special budget breakfast hangout with tax experts, eminent tax experts, Yogesh, Thar, Anish, Thacker. Both do not need any introduction. Therefore, we start straight. Exactly, not 2 hours, 1 hour, for 55 minutes to go for Finance Minister Nirmala.
10:30 is what I
11 a.m., right?
11 or
It's
10:30.
always 11 a.m. I'm not sure that convention will be broken.
Right.
1 hour, 55 minutes to go for the budget speech. We did have an interim budget on February 1. It was not a vote on account. It actually saw some tax amendments. This is the full budget for the rest of the year from July to March, that is. And Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman's first budget. I think it will be after almost a few decades that a woman would be presenting the budget. It will be a historic occasion for sure. And everyone is waiting with bated breath as to what are the tax amendments that are going to come in the union budget. If the economic survey document yesterday is any precursor, I think over the next 5 years, you should expect radical changes in tax policy. The direct tax code may be just a few months away. I think a lot of us were thinking that if the direct tax code, if they're going to make a big push for it, then you would only see tinkering on the edges as far as the amendments are concerned in this budget. If you look at if you look at the newspapers over the last if you look at the newspaper over the last few weeks and one second. Yeah, if you look at the newspapers over the last few weeks, then you would think that a slew of amendments are going to come. And I don't think there is any bigger amendment. Than inheritance tax, which is being discussed, debated, speculated. We do not know how many people have betted on whether inheritance tax is going to come or not. But I think some of the other things we'll discuss over the next 30 minutes. Capital gains, whether we'll see it there. Angel tax, because the economic survey document talks about the need to foster optimal tax policy. There was one headline which many of us missed before a week or two back, which was on whether loss-making companies will have to pay. We do not know how that will work. Tax litigation. The economic survey document, surprisingly, or should I say, actually not surprisingly, should have happened years ago. It almost starts by saying that the single biggest constraint for the country today to grow, or the impediment to economic growth, is the litigation, the pendency of cases, which stands at a staggering 3.5 crore cases across the country. We'll discuss that as well. Tax also contributes to that pendency. And we'll discuss something that has not been discussed much over the year or so, but trend which is unmistakable, which is to enforce tax provisions through the sword of prosecution. That's been a trend over the last 12 months. Will that trend get amplified over the next year or two is something that we should look at. Quick take, Yogesh bhai, start with you. Inheritance tax, yes or no?
Uh, well, the answer should be no, because see, 2017 we found OECD writing something that India should look at inheritance tax. So it has been our somehow from ages Indian mentality that somebody from the West tells you something, therefore say yoga. And we are still not out of that. We want to emulate the Western world wherever it is convenient to us. We don't emulate the Western world where it is not convenient to us. It happens with the child and it happens with the government. So I have a few issues or problems in terms of economic issues arising out of this particular inheritance tax if it is really implemented. Because as my senior Mr. Mehta always says that in economics there are consequences, there are no miracles. So if you do something, something has to follow. Now, the natural result of introducing inheritance tax would be that you are discouraging savings, and therefore you are discouraging capital formation, and therefore you are discouraging the future economic activities. And therefore that's nothing but a deadweight loss to the society, to the government, to the economy as a whole. So that's one big negative in terms of introducing this tax. Secondly, you are undermining the level of charities which large, because you say that we will introduce inheritance tax only for the so-called super rich. I don't know what the definition of super rich would be, but then these super rich are the people who have been doing charity all their lives, and that has supplemented the efforts of the government in a big way. You look at, I mean, I would not like to name, but that's something which will be discouraged, because despite having done charity all their lives and donated a large part of their wealth for good of the society, at the end of the day, if you still have to pay inheritance tax, then you're discouraging that part.
Inheritance tax, I think, before I move to Anish, on what does it mean? What are the tax implications for that? Do you think, as someone who is like a tax expert and advisor to certain promoters, it will be a big distraction for the promoters? It will be a distraction.
Yeah, the wealth today is lying in the value of shares. Okay, value of the shares in the companies which people are operating. That's a major wealth. Now, if really speaking, you are interested in taxing dead properties, then exempt from the wealth tax, you exempt from inheritance tax, you exempt the value of the operating assets which are there, productive assets which are there, shares in the companies which you have grown, which you have nurtured over all your life. You will find at the end of the day, those value of those shares are going to be taxed, simply because it's passing to somebody on death. That is therefore a dampener, as I said, in creation of wealth, in creation of value in the society. So that's you're right. It's going to be a dampener.
Yogesh is saying it will be a dampener. Anish, how many structures have you already created to ensure that the promoters are not affected?
I'll take the fifth one on that. But the point I still think, and I agree with you.
The fifth one is not in India.
Whatever. I think you got that I'd rather not answer. But the point really is that India is a country where, as a son, you are expected to honor your father's debt obligation, right? And if that is what it is, and if you're morally expected to honor and people do honor, then I don't think inheritance tax is right. Plus, if you would introduce inheritance tax, you would also introduce correspondingly, I would suspect, a gift tax, which, you know, otherwise what would happen is people would give away their assets to their children during their lifetime. So, inheritance tax without gift tax, I believe, is a slightly toothless tiger. Economically, I think the wealth that gets created after payment to income tax, and our income tax is at the highest rate of 35%, right, for the so-called super rich. So from that perspective, again, the money has already suffered income tax, right? Why would we want to make it suffer less tax? Because at each accretion also, right, even when you earn money from your business, you accumulate, you earn interest, you pay tax on that interest. So therefore, economically, again, why would you want to pay tax on already tax?
Anish, for a lot of people, uh, I will put myself there. My head is also getting there. But a lot of young tax professionals who are watching this, how would the inheritance tax work? How does it work? And what is the history of the inheritance tax? Maybe to take us through that, Anish.
Yeah. So I think, inheritance tax essentially works on what you leave as legacy to your successors, right? You obviously have exemptions like one residential house. You will also have a basic exemption limit to say that only inheritance beyond the particular point will, get taxed, right? And the rate again would depend on, the West has rates between 40 and 60% of your wealth sometimes. I don't think India is ready for that, as I said earlier. Uh, I'm not sure when estate duty came in, Yogesh Bhai may help, but I suspect, I remember that it went away in March 84. And if I remember correctly, it went away because the cost of collection far outweighed the collections that, the government made in terms of the estate duty. So, again, when you introduce something called as inheritance tax or estate duty, one will have to be careful in terms of, what is it that you're expecting in terms of collection and what is it that you're going to spend. The other thing is that it was always administered by the income tax department. Today we are seeing the tax officers struggle to even complete income tax assessments. And one of the reasons for dropping wealth tax was that even though you had an income tax officer administering wealth tax, right? Really, assessment used to happen, few and far between. So I don't know how, again, from a administration perspective, you would administer inheritance tax.
Yeah, so just to supplement one point, which companies have already suffered tax. So we have a person, individual has already suffered tax. Now here, the wealth is created in the hands of the individual because it has received dividend from the companies, which he is having. Now those that dividend, number one, has suffered tax by way of profits of the companies. Number two, it has suffered tax by way of dividend distribution tax in the hands of the companies. Number three, it has suffered tax by way of so-called super rich dividend tax, because you say that anything about 10 lakh rupees is a super rich dividend. You hear that? Number four, it has suffered tax because of your 14A disallowances that are happening in the companies
Yeah, income is
income is exempt. So this so-called dividend, which has flown to the individual, which has created his savings, which has created his wealth, has suffered for high tax. Now we want to do the best, as I said, to bring in inheritance tax, but you have you don't have the four levels of dividend taxation. On the contrary, you have different tax limits for taxes paid by the company in the UK and other countries. So if you want to bring it, so really speaking, is really India ready for this tax at this point of time? Have you set up a structure so that you are avoiding these multiple levels of taxation, so as to justify this tax at the end of your life? Is a big question that needs to be answered. There are some economic consequences of
yeah,
this.
from a OECD tax policy directive, definitely special problem for us. How can tax contribute to achieve the Modi government's vision? And he makes a strong case for inheritance tax, and he's saying that tax is a
Like the
way of reducing social inequalities, income inequalities, and reducing the heritage. For introducing an inheritance tax, I would threshold for the target to the revenue.
I'm not really sure whether India is ready for this today. Uh, and and like do you have exit tax in India? Like a foreigner investing in India and he wants to exit. Do you have exit tax in India? A foreign national foreigner can come and invest in India, make money, and exit and tax in terms of capital gains. And all Indian residents, nationals who want to tax them multiple times over their lifetime, and then at the end of it, if they're left, we want to tax them on estate.
What are the three problems that you have from a tax point of view?
Big problem we have is discouraging, as I said, saving for therefore once again generating on the tax.
What the tax controversy
This will lead to tax side taxation, and therefore this will lead to all sorts of planning and all sorts of tax avoidance schemes.
will be hit by that?
It may or may not be.
Is that one reason why it may come now rather than BTC? Because if you do it if you do while BTC, everyone gets time to plan. If you do it now and if anyone does planning now, it could be hit by that.
If I want to create a trust and if I want to do something by way of settling my properties during the lifetime, so that the property does not pass under a will, because will, we know, is an instrument which has been subject of litigation and which can be easily targeted, and the entire wealth will go into a complete limbo for years together. So a trust structure is a very well recognized structure and preferred structure in terms of succession planning. Now, if somebody does that, therefore mean that he's doing it only for the purpose of avoidance of estate duty. I don't think that's the right way of looking at it. Creation of a trust has good family reasons for doing it. So I don't think that GAR can really come in.
Also, from a technical perspective, GAR would always mean a reduction of tax liability under the Income Tax Act. I presume this will be a separate act. I don't think you can bequest in the definition of the term income, right? So therefore, potentially also from a technical perspective, whether GAR will apply to an inheritance is a big question mark.
All in all, Yogesh bhai, Anish, both will be controversial with it. This will be a bit controversial. Definitely, lots of work for Anish in terms of litigation and so on. So he will be very happy that when we start to see the problem, we can, yeah, yeah. I think there are some phones which are ringing on the other side. That's fine. So Anish and Yogesh bhai are saying there'll be a lot of work from them for them over the next 2 years if inheritance tax does come in.
That's work I don't necessarily want, but
just not to be sarcastic or mean at all, but every finance minister keeps saying that we want to make the tax so simple that you won't need to go to a chartered accountant, and then you start to wonder how Yogesh bhai and Anish have aged so quickly.
yeah.
But we'll move to the next issue, and that is angel tax. I'm sure expecting something on this because it's genuinely become, I wouldn't say harassment, but this has become a little bit of a nuisance value for a lot of startups who, having to keep their day-to-day business aside, have to focus on some of these things.
I think it has, and I think again you introduced those provisions to target shareholding which was done in a Benami situation, right, where you typically have shareholders who don't have the means to invest into companies, right, and that was the ostensible reason for introducing section 5627B, where somebody introduced capital into a company at a premium where the company didn't deserve it. But whether a company deserves a premium or not is, I think, a businessman's decision and investor's decision. It's a commercial decision rather than a tax decision. And therefore, you've had cases, you recently had a Delhi tribunal decision where there was a film startup company where three, eminent investors, one industrialist and two, eminent share brokers invested in that company. And, the valuation was done by a DCF and the department still challenged. And the tribunal, rightly, in my opinion, came very heavily to say that you cannot apply section 5627B where you have investors of the, pedigree of those three investors. So from that perspective, one would believe that there is still, room to curb that nuisance, right? Curb cases where I'm sure, people of lesser means, people of questionable means invest at high premium. But if there is, a situation where clearly an informed decision is taken by an investor, looking at the future prospects of the company, even though the company may currently not have, any wealth.
Anish, simple point is taken. When people like Anand Mahindra, Rakesh Jhunjhunwala, as you said, invest, you have to take them at face value. If you look at the finance minister, she's going to come back and say that this is all because of the shell companies, the share premiums. I think a lot of the regulations that come in is also because of the excesses of a system at times which is broken. And when you try to fix it, you always over legislate. And therefore it becomes a pain even for honest taxpayers. Anish, a quick, what would be your solution to this problem? How would you introduce an amendment in the section which will address the issue?
You already have under section 68 to take care of capacity of the investors. I believe those amendments are sufficient, right? Now you've questioned or you have allowed the tax department to question the source of the source. I think you cannot do anything more than that. Section 5627B, in my opinion, needs very, very serious reconsideration. And in my view, it has to go.
I fully agree, Anish, because you already have that tax which is more than 80%. I think, for those unexplained cash credits or something, implement it properly, administer the law properly. And that's a good enough a deterrent for anyone to, go toe that line. And therefore, to tax share premium, it's completely distorting the concept of income. You've gone much beyond concept of income already, and
but why hasn't any such case reached the High Court? Why hasn't they questioned this so far?
We are not willing today to fight the government. Don't want to get into litigations.
Litigation is expensive,
and
and it's time consuming.
And file writ petitions. You don't want, we are scared.
Yeah, we won't talk about that, but we'll go to the next one. So point taken, angel tax has to go. I think that will be a big sentiment booster and may not actually reduce the tax. The tax coffers won't be too light by this move. Angel tax has to go, say both Yogesh and Anish.
You are looking at measures to boost capital markets. I suspect if you make 56 to 7B go, your capital markets will automatically get a boost. You see what happens to stock prices.
Yeah, and not to overstate the case, but look, every day the investments that are coming in every day in the front pages of any business paper or even our national dailies, all of them talk about the $100 million round, $500 million round. Some of them $1 billion rounds. So many unicorns, and you don't want these companies to be explaining how they arrived at the valuation. I think the question really, I think the fundamental question, Anish and Yogesh, really is, should the tax department be sitting on judgment when it comes to the valuation of any startup? That's the fundamental question.
Absolutely, and I think the answer has to be in the negative. You want to encourage capital formation. You want, the next global giants to come from India. If you're going to, start questioning them at their formation stage, at their startup stage, I think we're taking one step backward before we even move forward. So it doesn't make sense.
Some of the other issues, we'll deal with them quickly before we move to DDC. Loss-making companies to pay tax. I did not read the full article, but we did carry it as a headline in one of our news digest and in one of the press that they may want loss-making companies to pay tax. How will that happen?
I don't know.
Is it another MAT?
It is. I mean, today you already have a MAT where you have allowances, and I strongly feel that today MAT itself has overlived its utility because you do not have those sort of profit exemptions from profits anymore. So therefore,
so the difference between book profits and the real profits is not much.
It's not much nowadays. It will not be because you don't have that type of incentives. You had time when your depreciation was very high. You had investment allowances and you had all sorts of things. Now today you don't have that. So therefore, MAT itself has overlived its utility and added complications by taxing all your notional credits which go on account of Ind AS. You're crediting to the profit and loss account and you are charging MAT on that. That's also a big issue. So there is a need of revamping the MAT provisions anyway. Now,
MAT, by the way, is Yogesh Bhai's favorite topic.
No. It is,
and capital gain is Anish's.
It's everybody's favorite topic. I seriously think, and I agree with Yogesh Bhai, that we don't need MAT in today's scenario. We just don't. And
we don't need angel tax. We don't need MAT. We don't need inheritance tax.
We don't need loss-making companies to pay tax. That is something which I do not know. The logic of it completely baffles me, to be very honest.
Capital gains?
Yeah, capital gains, I think, again, if we see some observations in the economic survey, they want to say that we want to encourage long-term investment. Therefore, maybe the expectation may be that the 12-month limit for capital gains may probably be relooked at. There is a flip side to it. The flip side is that you will have the capital markets going, going in a direction that the government doesn't want them to go in. So that has to be a very delicate balancing act. The other thing that the economic survey really talks about is the fact that you have, you have a very thin difference between long-term capital gains tax and short-term capital gains tax in listed securities. 15% short-term, 10% on long-term. The delta doesn't seem very high. If the government is going to seriously relook at this and probably either reduce the capital gain tax or then make long-term capital gains tax-free with a higher securities transaction tax, I think the markets will probably react, better. I would think that, again, securities transaction tax is a transaction level tax. So sometimes conceptually, maybe it's easier to tax transactions than outcomes, right? It makes life less complicated, as Arun said. I don't have to worry about computations. I don't have to worry about today. You have 10% tax without indexation, right? You want to make it with indexation, that adds a complication. You take transaction tax slightly higher, it makes life simple. People take it as a cost of business and move on. So let's see what happens. I think it's interesting times. Overlay of the DTC also will have to be looked at, because you're anyway going to have a DTC which will hopefully appear sooner rather than later. And therefore, what sort of tweaking do you want to make in the short to medium term? Something that the government
Yogesh, the place at which DTC is going, and Anish has preempted my next question. Um, you know, it looks like, I'm not saying a foregone conclusion, because it's been a fifth or sixth shot at the cherry. We've tried this for now 3 decades, Yogesh, right? But if it does happen over the next year or so, it will be if you as big as a GST. Of course, income tax is something that 90% of the tax professionals are anyway well versed with. So I think it will be a little more easier in terms of implementing it. But it will be erasing a lot of things you think that we've learned over the last 40 years. And someone like Mr. Gautam Doshi has said repeatedly that you are unsettling a settled law. I don't think we any longer have the really have the leeway to even point that out, because I think we've moved really far down that path. If the government is committed to bringing a new direct tax code, how do we do it in the most effective and efficient manner is the question.
Yeah, that's true. So, no doubt the law has many redundant provisions already that needs to be removed. The law needs to be simplified, but I'm not too sure the way. Will it really get into simplification, or whether it will add to the complications? We would be importing concepts which are there world over. We would be implementing, say for example, CFC was one of the items which we found in the DTC, which was introduced earlier. So we will try to bring that over here, and things like that. So it may be a bigger code. It may be a code which will sort of nullify the effect of all your good Supreme Court decisions, and therefore, yes, to that extent, will be unsettling the settled law.
Will we have to start from scratch again? Will the fundamentals change?
I don't think, like, say, for example, the Companies Act 2013 is not, it's a new law, but it's not that different from the Companies Act.
But we already have some 400-500 amendments to it in the last 4-5 years.
I agree with you. So it will,
you don't want to go down that route, and it's a delegated law, Companies Act,
yeah,
where you may have maybe fewer sections, but
correct,
again hundreds and hundreds of rules.
So that's the worst part of it, that you have a small legislation and then you give powers to the CBDT or to the government to notify things.
How do you make it workable? Okay, simple. How do you make a new DTC workable in a much more efficient, better manner than the current Income Tax Act, which has been litigated to the hilt?
I would feel that you look at our old laws. You say, for example, you had a provision in the Companies Act which was defining a holding and subsidiary company, and there are 3 examples below that. Okay, A has a holding of B, B is a holding of C, and therefore A is a holding of C. Now, give such examples, illustrations under your sections, and that we find that is there in the tax laws of other developed countries. So that may be a way in which you simplify the legislation. To make an income tax law a small piece of legislation is virtually impossible, because it's not possible, because the way in which the economy has grown, the science has grown, commerce has grown, trade has grown, it's not possible to make it into a 2 pages, 3 pages.
You'll think it's a joke, but I requested Anish and Yogesh in response to someone who tweeted that how do you write an income tax code in 5 pages? I actually asked Anish and Yogesh to take a shot and to attempt it.
We're struggling, to be honest. Small is not necessarily beautiful as far as law is concerned. Because, law has to take into account not only foreseen but unforeseen circumstances as well. So therefore, to make it simple beyond the point is really a challenge.
When Mr. Donald Trump ran for president, and it was a long shot campaign 3 years back, he said that he would, there were many forms and 7 brackets, and he said, I'll make the tax law so simple that H&R Block, the largest tax return filer in the US, would be out of business. See what has happened. It's a 480 pages Income Tax Act called the US Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They even give such nice names: to an income tax act. I don't know what our act it will be called, something like that, maybe. But Anish, impossible. I mean, every day you get up and see that you have a 480 pages act which they have rewritten, and then you have so many rules. You have things like guilty and so on and so forth. Not only easy.
I think US is a complicated country. If you look at US, it is in a way complicated. It wants to, prescribe everything in black and white. Sometimes that's not possible, which is why it has pages and pages of law. I'll just take FATCA, which are 4 sections, sections 1471 to 1474 of the, revenue code. And you have instructions which run into, this thick book, right, in terms of how to implement it. There are regulations around it. So, and we have the same thing, I think, in some other laws in our country. For example, FEMA, or you have, GST. All of those things actually sometimes, create more complex situations for a taxpayer.
Yeah.
The taxpayer, I think, wants a law which, it's also about administration. I don't think it's about the language. It's also about the administration of the law. He wants to, have comfort in terms of what is his tax liability on a transaction. If you keep guessing as to what his tax liability is, I think it's going to be, that the most detrimental thing to capital formation, to, growth in this country.
Yeah, yeah, and Anish, Yogesh, the economic survey document, I think it will be a travesty of justice if we do not discuss this. I would say it's a wonderful document. It's focused heavily on taxation. It says we need an optimal tax policy, a tax system that can foster innovation, raise revenues efficiently and fairly, while encouraging bona fide taxpayers and punishing malified ones. It's also making a strong case for enhancing tax compliance through deployment of behavioral insights. It's again and again saying that you need to make paying taxes honorable. They even making suggestions like, why don't you name roads, hospitals, monuments after the highest taxpayers, people who paid the highest taxes for a decade or so. And they're saying that there is a factor called the tax morale. The tax morale, and they say it is driven by two factors: vertical fairness and horizontal fairness. They're also saying that you reach out to the taxpayers, tell them that this is heavily borrowed from the UK, and this is in fact a case study that best-selling authors have written about, where the UK sent messages, sent emails to the taxpayers saying that in your community, 90% people have paid taxes, you aren't, and I think that worked. So they're saying, why don't we try something like that as well? They're saying that public shaming could be a strategy to reduce, tax evasion, but persistent public shaming could also be a little negative. And they have come down. They have come down negatively against the tax amnesty scheme, saying that that affects the government's credibility as also the taxpayers' intrinsic motivation to comply. And of course, the one thing on which we will not let either, without answering this, we will not either of them go, is the 3.5 crore pending cases to which tax is also a big contributor. May not be a very big contributor, maybe only 1% of the 3.5 crore. Uh, One visit to the Bombay High Court last week, and I told Anish on a 11 p.m. call that you almost feel that the system, when it comes to the litigation, is broken, and we just don't know how to address it. If some 50 cases on the cause list, if only two are going to be heard in a day, and the judges also have to do justice. They're human after all. How is it going to be broken if we have pendency of 10 years? A software taxation case, to give a simple example, the SLP is lying in the Supreme Court. Very important case, several thousand crores of tax revenues at stake. And the Supreme Court has for 5, 6 years not a criticism of Supreme Court at all. But I think it's in the queue. But that's how it is.
It all starts from the grassroots. The sense that the assessing officer makes an assessment, which is really based on the targets that he has to achieve, and therefore he makes an assessment which is.
the hell? Fuck.
सुनाई भी नहीं दे
ये विश्वास
सुनाई भी नहीं दे रहा
विश्वास सुनाई नहीं दे रहा